Hello and welcome to Stork'd, the podcast in which we explore the many ways people define and create family. This is Julia, and I am so excited to introduce this podcast to you and to share with you a little bit about what you're going to hear in season 1. This is a podcast in which we ask the question, what is family? And I've got a number of really diverse and rich and interesting answers to that question. Some of the things you're going to hear are about fertility journeys. We're also going to hear about adoption. We're going to hear from somebody who is an adopted child and how that has shaped his life, and somebody who has considered adoption and chosen to go in a different direction. We are going to hear from a teen parent who is now the parent of 5 children and a grandparent. We're going to hear several entrepreneurship journeys. We're going to hear about people who have worked with a spouse or an ex-spouse. We are also going to hear from somebody who is parenting on a different continent from her husband. We have blended families and second marriages and step parenting and a life coach and a health coach and a grief coach. And it's all just a beautiful mix of answering the question, what is family? But first, you're going to hear from me in episode 1 about why I created this podcast and a little bit about my own journey to create a family. Given that I was inviting others to share their rich experiences, their deep experiences, I figured it was only fair for me to do the same. So, welcome to Stork'd, and I really hope you like season 1. This episode is episode 1. It's the introductory episode to explain sort of what this podcast is all about and what you can expect to hear in the future. My name is Julia. I work in finance. I live in the Boston area, and I'm in my late 30s. I never expected that I would do something as creative and outside of my comfort zone as launching a podcast. This is all very new for me. It's very exciting, but it's very new for me. And let me tell you a little bit about what brings me to this point and why I have decided to create this podcast. So, as a woman in your late 30s, you start to think about fertility in a certain way. And my journey to this point has been a slightly rocky or complicated one. I have been in long-term relationships that didn't last, or they didn't lead to the moment of walking down the aisle and the 2.5 kids and the traditional pathways that many people take when they're creating a family. You know, that part of coming together with a partner and building something together in a traditional way. So far, that hasn't happened for me. I have had some exquisite relationships, and I'm very lucky to have had wonderful people in my life. But at this point, I am thinking about what family means to me and how I might want to build one. And so I had to start looking at non-traditional methods, non-traditional paths forward. And I've been doing this exploration for a number of years since my last relationship ended when I was 34. And at that time, I was absolutely rocked. I was just like totally crushed by the loss of this relationship. It was devastating to me, not only because I had really high expectations and hopes that it would lead to that traditional path, that we were taking the steps required to go forward and to result in a marriage and babies, etc. But also when it ended, it was almost like I was grieving the loss of the relationship alongside the loss of the path that I expected for myself. My vision for my future disappeared instantaneously when I lost that relationship. And so I was 34 or maybe I was 35, and I started to really panic. You know, I started to look at the countdown, and I started to do the fertility math that some people are so familiar with when I say the words fertility math that might resonate with some of our listeners. And you start to backwards calculate, I have X many years to find the right person and X many years to build a family, and how am I going to do all this? In the meantime, I had this like massive healing journey to go through. So I wasn't ready to find my person for a period of time. I needed to spend time in deep reflection and with life coaches and in conversation with friends and reading self-help books and just reading fiction and, you know, doing all those things, rediscovering myself, rediscovering what made me feel whole and healthy and felt like a coming home to myself. And so I took almost a year, maybe a little bit longer, off from dating, and then sort of made some of those fumbles along the way of diving in and making some mistakes, which were all healthy and great learning experiences, and I don't regret a single one. But What it led to was I was really afraid that I might end up in the wrong relationship because the fertility math was counting down in the back of my head. And I was really cognizant I am really cognizant that it's easy to say, okay, I really want a family, and therefore to end up choosing the wrong partner and making a lifelong decision that is not quite the right fit for either of you. And if you choose the wrong partner, it's not just unfair to you, it's unfair to that person. So I had to start thinking about what I wanted. And I had to wrestle with the question, what does a family look like to me? Does it involve kids? And for me, I had a deep and resonant yes. A family for me involves kids. It really, for me, is something that matters. And then the follow-on questions are, do they have to be your kids? Do they have to be your biological children? Or would you consider adoption? Or would you consider foster parenting, or would you consider other paths forward? And how urgent, how important is this immediately? Do you have time to wait to see what your path might take you on, see what happens around the bend? Or is there a sense of urgency? Does it feel really important to do it soon? And so I started having conversations with people because I am, at my core, somebody who really likes diligence. My finance background is all about looking into the depth of companies and understanding what makes them tick and understanding how we can help them grow and make a path forward for themselves. And in the same way, I had to do the same for me. I had to turn the mirror onto my own self and have conversations with anyone and everyone. So I'm the type of person, I'm going to ask you about your family life. I'm going to ask you what's going on for you. I'm going to ask you how you made the choices you made, and sit in reflection to understand whether or not those make sense for me. Try on that life for myself. Ultimately, I was really in awe of the amazing conversations that I had with people and the various and really cool ways that are maybe not explicitly shared with the world about how one can create a family. I don't think when you're in a position like mine where you start to have the difficult questions with yourself about what do I want, I don't know that there are a lot of resources laying out the stories of other people and other experiences so that you can hear their story and it either resonates or it opens up an option for you or it opens up an opportunity for you and helps you think about something a little bit differently. And in my soul searching and in my data collection, I found those stories. I found people who are willing to say, here's what happened for me, and here's what I chose for myself, and here's what I wrestled with, here's the monster I struggled with. And not all of those things were about fertility. I want to underscore that this is, for me, it's a fertility journey most likely, but it's definitely not a podcast about fertility. It's about family. It's about so much more than simply an IVF process or an IUI process or the mechanics of that. And so hearing these stories, I started to think, what would happen if I shared these? What would happen if I presented them to others? Would it be useful? And could I create a mechanism that would enable the sharing? And that's how Stork'd was born. If we take a step back even further, Stork'd was actually born in Colombia. So as I speak right now, we are deep into the COVID-19 pandemic. And the final thing that I did just before the world shut down, literally days before the world shut down, is I had occasion to visit Colombia, and specifically to visit an orphanage in Colombia. I want to stop and say that my personal life and my professional life have given me a lot of luxury, a lot of opportunity to travel. Sometimes it's been for the good, wonderful vacations and awesome opportunities to check out new companies or check out new parts of the world. And sometimes it's been a little taxing, a little too much, maybe even a little escapism from the day-to-day realities of the fact that I don't have the life that I hope to lead or that I had expected to lead. So I'm sitting in Colombia, and I was there with the purpose of visiting an orphanage, which has deep meaning for members of my family. And it's not my story to share, so I'm going to talk around that story a little bit, although it is one of the most beautiful stories, and I wish I could share it with you all now. It would have to be from the mouth of the person who experienced it. So I went back to this orphanage to visit with members of my family for whom the orphanage is important. And two things happened for me at that orphanage. The first is I got to have a conversation with the woman who's been running it for 40 years. And we talked about everything from the way in which international adoption has evolved over the past 40 years, and also how Colombia's international policy and adoption policies have evolved over the past 40 years, and how the adoption world is shifting to supporting families if they're capable and if it's safe for a child to stay in that family, supporting families to provide the best for a child before they consider adoption. And that woman asked me some hard questions. She said, if you were thinking about adoption, would you consider an older child, or would you consider a special needs child? And would you consider a multi-year journey to meet that child, to have that child delivered to you? And she used a phrase that was just so powerful. She said, these are children from your heart. They're not from your womb, they're from your heart. And while I had been asking these questions of myself in many ways, it was the first time an outsider had said, this is what it looks like if you were to pursue this path. How does it feel? How does that feel? And will you check in with yourself? And is it something that you want to do? And I am still wrestling with those questions that she asked in that moment. I still think about them constantly, and I'm not prepared to give a perspective one way or another right now, but they do live with me and live in my soul in a way that is helping me shape and think about my journey. And that was really, really powerful. And I thought, oh gosh, I wish there was some way to share her story and to share this story. And then the second thing that happened is I was witness to an extremely tender moment between a father and daughter in that orphanage. And it still brings tears to my mind, and it still makes me just go, wow, family is so much more than the biology that it sometimes includes, and so much more than delivering a child on your own. And in that space of those two profound experiences, those two deeply touching and meaningful experiences, and then in the flight home, and then immediately going into lockdown and sitting and having that to be the point of reflection in the midst of COVID, led me to say, I'm ready to share these stories. I'm ready to invite others to share their experiences in hopes that we all can learn something about how the way we want to define our own families can be expanded. So that's the purpose of the podcast. It's that I really think that those moments of hearing somebody else's experience, hearing somebody else's journey, is deeply connective. It allows us to feel a sense of universal humanness within one another. And it also helps think about, what is it that I want? And so as I was exploring this for myself, I am hoping that the questions and the people that I talk to and the experiences that we draw from are also helpful to anyone who chooses to listen to this podcast. That's my wish and my intention. I'm really hoping that it's useful or interesting or helpful. I'm expecting in the podcast to mostly share other people's stories, but here and there to interject, where my head is at and what I'm thinking about. So where am I now? It is the fall of 2020. I began in earnest a fertility journey at the beginning of the year, where I interviewed as many fertility doctors as humanly possible, and I selected one and I started down a path. And then I spent a lot of time in COVID evaluating sperm donors and trying to find the right one, and crying on the phone with my friends about what is it that I'm looking for and who is it that I want to be the biological parent of a future child if this pathway forward works. And I spent a lot of time thinking about alternative paths, including adoption, including foster to adopt, and including maybe not having kids, although that's really, as I mentioned earlier, my least preferred path. And I'm somewhere in the middle of that. I'd say if a fertility journey is a long path, let's call me, 15% of the way there. I also have been thinking a lot about step parenting, because there's somebody in my life for which, if things progressed in a certain way, that may be something to explore, and asking a lot of questions about how does one do that, and what does it look like, and how does it feel, and what's the experience of it. So to some extent, a lot of the people that you'll hear in this podcast are those people that I have questions for. How did you pick your sperm donor? How did you pick your egg donor? How did you think about becoming a step parent for the first time? And a lot of the stories that I hope to share are things that are so different from my own that they help expand me in other ways and help expand us all in other ways. And I'm hopeful that those stories are equally useful. So what can you expect from Stork'd, the podcast, going forward? The first is that I want the experiences shared to be everyday experiences. I want the stories to be from people who could be your next door neighbor or your best friend or your little sister. And whenever somebody says, okay, I'm thinking about this in my life, I say, oh, you know what? I've got a story for you. I've got somebody, you've got to hear their experience because it may be useful in your own. For that reason, the people that I'm speaking to in some cases are best friends and college housemates and other people that I know within my life, but also people that have been introduced to me or who've raised their hands and said, I want to share my story too, please. They're not necessarily celebrities. This isn't about flash and glamour, and it's more about the real everyday story, which means that some of our storytellers may have perspectives that are different from your own or have wrestled with the big questions and come to conclusions that are different from your own. And I think that's important and valuable. Yeah, that's what you should expect from Stork'd, is cool stories from people who are wrestling with this question, what is family? As I myself am wrestling with this question, what kind of family do I want to build? We're going to release episodes in seasons, and that's really important to me. If you're talking about the diversity of experiences, you get that moment of, oh my God, there's so many stories out there. So if you are in the mood to binge something, binge this. You'll get a whole season all at once, and then the next one, and then the next one, hopefully. So what I ask of the audience is share any stories that you love with people who may need to hear them. Let me know if you want to share your story. Sign up for our newsletter, like the podcast, all the good stuff that all the other podcasters tell you to do. Yeah, and then there's one other thing, which is I've been thinking a lot about this story that was shared to me. And the story is called Welcome to Holland. And that is, it's written by a woman who had a disabled child, and she wrote this parable around what it's like to have a disabled child. And she writes about imagining she wants to go on a trip to Italy, and imagining that she spent her whole life planning this perfect trip to Italy and getting so excited about Italy and thinking about the food and thinking about the wine and planning her routes and all the wonderful things that she's going to experience along the way. And she gets on the plane, and when she lands, everyone greets her and they say, "Welcome to Holland." She goes, "Wait, I'm supposed to be in Italy. I'm not supposed to be in Holland. I'm supposed to be in Italy. What is this?" And at first there's feelings of frustration and anger and disappointment and fear. And then she comes to realize that, you know what? Holland's actually kind of lovely. It's got tulips and it's got all these wonderful people and it's got this rich culture, and I could be very happy here. And she learns to adjust. And for me, the fertility journey that I'm on and the family building journey that I'm on is Holland. It's not what I expected. It's not what I had hoped for or wished for. But it's going to be kind of great, I hope. And I found that particular story to be incredibly useful. I touch on it all the time when I'm having moments of self-doubt or fear or frustration or just anger that things didn't work out the way I wanted them to, which is quite frankly all the time. And so I wanted to share that with you, and I really love it. It was shared in a book, and I will reference it in the notes. So that's Stork'd. I hope you enjoy it, and I think it's going to be a wild ride, and I hope you buckle up and jump in and have fun, because I think it's going to be fun. I think it's going to be great. So thank you for listening, and I hope you like it.
Thank you for listening to Stork'd with your host, Julia Karol. This podcast is changing the conversation around the ways people define and create family. For more information, visit storkedpodcast.com to sign up for our newsletter. And while you're there, leave us a message describing what a modern family means to you. That's STORKD podcast.com.